Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we're recording. Okay, Fraser,
Okay.
please introduce yourself, everybody.
George, hi. I'm Fraser MacLean. I'm in Scotland at the moment, but I've worked all over the place. I spent quite a lot of time working down in London, always in some or other aspect of the movie or TV business. I had the chance to move over to the States in the late 1990s, and I've been working in movies from the get-go. When I left college in 1983, I trained as a film editor. I did a graphic design degree back in the day when none of the colleges in the UK were particularly interested in training people for movie design or production design, let alone animation. And where there was animation training, it tended to be a kind of artisan approach to it. So to be able to accomplish the kinds of things that people at the Disney Studios or Warner Brothers, the stuff that I grew up looking at when I was a kid on television, thinking, well, that's what animation is. Nobody was teaching it in that kind of a way. So I graduated with a degree in graphic design, and then the opportunity I had to do movie training after that was through something called the Scottish Film Training Trust. And the resources were limited, so you could train to be a camera operator, a sound recordist, or a film editor. And I had done some work on video when I was doing my graphic design degree because the college bought some equipment and they didn't really know what to do with it. So I tried to make a bunch of kind of music videos. It was kind of in that weird no man's land between Bohemian Rhapsody and MTV, if that makes sense. That people were beginning to cotton on to the idea that part of the sales mechanism for pop songs was moving image. So the whole kind of, they used to call them pop promos or rock videos or whatever people call them these days. So I had run into quite a lot of difficulty there because I wasn't terribly, I love the creative side, but I wasn't very good at the discipline side. So I really used to drive the technician crazy. There was a lovely woman called Lynn Bogan who was in the basement of the architecture building, and she had this offline edit suite, and I would turn up with all these U-matic videotapes, which were kind of like a biscuit tin. They were huge tapes. Yeah. And she would sort of say, this is all very well, but I don't have time to sit here and go through these and find where the footage is, where your friends didn't either crash into the scenery or break the props, and you have to go away, you have to make a list, you have to give me an inventory of what's on there, you have to look at the time code. So it was beginning to get into my head that there was a very, very particular discipline about movie making, and if I wanted to kind of pursue the idea of being a movie maker or a movie director, it wasn't just a one technique thing that you had to find out about the way that you would if you were doing ceramics or printmaking or whatever. There was this enormous kind of collection of different skills and talents involved in it. And I had done enough and made enough mistakes during my sort of experiments with video when I was a student that I realized that film editing was the boiler room of the process. So I was really lucky. I got accepted as the trainee that year for film editing, and the timing of it was good because in the UK, when I was growing up, we only had 3 television channels, which I know is kind of laughable now because there is just moving image information literally coming out of the walls now. I mean, if you come out of the tube station in London, at one of the stations that's further underground, like Tottenham Court Road tube station, all the images down the side of the escalators, which 5-10 years ago would have been posters, these are all plasma screens now. So you have companies that are actually developing site-specific advertising campaigns where somebody in one poster will hand a credit card to the person in the next poster, or a ball will bounce down the stairs, all that kind of stuff. But the degree to which moving image has taken over in people's mobile phones, with the internet, with advertising hoardings, with I think even in New York, some of these little triangular sort of ad stations on the top of the yellow cabs, I think there are some of those that are little LED or moving displays now. But at the time, we had just BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV, or STV if you lived in Scotland, Scottish Television. Yep. So the idea that we had a 4th channel, the original remit for Channel 4 in the UK was that it was to provide a platform for all of those groups of people who perhaps didn't have a voice in the mainstream. So it was really seen as a terrific opportunity for small independent companies and smaller groups of people who had, I guess, a kind of alternative voice or presence or worldview or whatever. It's changed a lot over the years, and now, of course, it's swamped by all the other Sky, satellite, cable, whatever. You know, there is this. We have the same profusion of TV channels. But in the early 1980s, as I was graduating and starting work in the movie industry, and here was Channel 4, so it was a great bit of timing, and I was able to work for lots of different local companies and smaller productions. But I had an opportunity to move to London to work for a company called Sands Films. And there's a really extraordinary husband and wife team, a producer called Richard Goodwin, and a director and screenwriter called Christine Edzard. And they had a company in these two old tea warehouses by the River Thames. And I met somebody in Scotland at a wedding who worked for them part-time, and they were having difficulty getting hold of somebody to run the cutting room when they were doing this very ambitious adaptation of a Charles Dickens novel called Little Dorrit. And the book itself is written in two parts, but Christine Edzard's screenplay adaptation of it broke it into in a very different way, so that it was the same story told from two different viewpoints, the two different characters. And the entire completed film in these two parts was going to be nearly 6 hours long. And they had a very talented assistant, a Belgian guy called Olivier Stockman, and they had an incredible team of people. They made the costumes in the studio. They had a guy called Richard Farrows who had a plaster workshop, so they were making all these extraordinary mouldings for the ceilings and the sets. They had a team of three guys from Scotland up in the top, carpenters, joiners, toy makers, who had spent 3 or 4 years building these tiny sort of 1/8, 16th quarter size models of the architecture in and around the Borough High Street where the central parts of the story take place. And when I turned up, I got on the bus overnight from Glasgow and went down there to be interviewed for the job to run the cutting room of this film. And I was sort of awake most of the night on the bus. The only place I had changed for the interview to look smart. I knew the guy who ran McDonald's on Shaftesbury Avenue. Wow. So I went and knocked on the door while all the kind of lettuce and buns and stuff were arriving in the morning, and said, "Can I change my shirt in your office?" And then just went down on the train. And when I arrived there, I met Christine Edzard on a set where somebody was actually building a tree, a leaf at a time. And I thought, I have to work for these guys. This is just my last ever opportunity to be at a studio that is a small family-run studio, but is also doing everything under the one roof. I thought, I can't, what more could you ask than to receive a salary to be helping create a film in that kind of context? Yeah. But the unfortunate thing there was that by the time we completed the film, the UK film industry was kind of in one of its downturn phases. So there was only a couple of other movies that were recruiting or crewing up when Little Dorrit wrapped. And that was Terry Gilliam was doing Baron Munchausen, and the other guys were doing Fish Called Wanda. So I wrote off to them, and nobody wanted to hire this whoever, nobody wanted to hire me. Yep. And I wrote lots of things off to people and didn't get anything back. But in the days before the internet, there were trade magazines and papers that you could buy, and in Screen International, I found a little drawing of Mickey Mouse sitting at an animation table, and it said Walt Disney are looking for talented animation personnel to work on a movie that combines animation and live action, and they're doing it in London. So I wrote off to them, and I didn't hear back, but I thought, I'm not going to let this one go. So I got the phone number and I phoned them up, and I got put through to Don Hahn, who is now, a very, very big cheese Disney producer, and also writer on animation, a lovely, lovely guy. Yeah. And he was in his sort of younger part of his career, was he and Max Howard kind of steered the whole production of Roger Rabbit in Camden in London. And he got my letter back out of the file, and he sort of went, well, we don't really need anybody, to do film editing because it's a small cutting room, but it says you went to art college, can you draw? And I had this kind of tense relationship with my tutors at the art college because I really enjoyed doing the traditional classical drawing, figure drawing, perspective, composition. I loved that, and that was okay in your foundation year, but when you went into a specialist design department like graphic design, they tended to want you to draw in a particular style or to do something that was idiosyncratic or personal, and I was never into that. So I had quietly squirreled away quite a lot of drawings that used to just irritate my tutors because they would just go, "You've got to stop doing this, you've got to try and develop a style of your own." And a lot of the drawings that I wound up not showing to my tutors because I knew they were going to upset them, that was really pretty much the folio stuff that got me hired on Roger. Go figure. But what Don Hahn saw in it, the main thing on Roger Rabbit was that they were doing more than had been done in Bedknobs and Broomsticks or Mary Poppins, because they couldn't simply allow the characters to remain flat cell cartoon characters. They had to look solid, and the way that was accomplished, there's an incredibly talented guy called Chris Knott who was head of the special effects unit in London, and he had been working for Dick Williams' studio in Soho Square, and they had developed level by level matte technique where you hand drew the mattes that represented the darker shaded areas of the character, and also other mattes that defined where a light would hit the side of a character, the edge or the rim light on the character. And we would animate those, and then those would be done as a multiple exposure and composited over in the States, but the individual art levels were all created in London. And in my figure drawing, Don and Chris, when they looked at my folder, I suppose thought that the way the figures were described or lit or whatever showed that I had a sense of what the solid thing was. And because I didn't have a background in doing, I hadn't learned animation as a character animator to do a walk cycle or a bouncing ball or any of that stuff, they kind of went, yeah, if you can start on Monday, come and help us draw shadows. So that's what I did, and that was how I got into it. And I carried on doing that for a few years because two of the junior producers who had worked for Dick Williams' studio, Alan Dewhurst and Andrew Ruman, they'd set up a company of their own called Passion Pictures, and they pretty much hired Chris and a bunch of us from the effects department on Roger Rabbit. And then over the next few years, because a lot of advertisers, a lot of agencies, a lot of clients, anybody who is particularly pitching a product to a family or a children's audience like breakfast cereal or a lot of sort of domestic things, kitchen cleaner and stuff like that, if they had a character that had to come to life off a cornflakes packet or off a bottle of kitchen cleaner, we would do those adverts. But the reason further down the line that I became interested in putting together a book about the layout process was that all of the work I did early on when I was learning on the job in animation was in this weird Roger Rabbit style hybrid where you had cartoon characters in the real world. So obviously we didn't have painted backgrounds, and there were very, very few commercials that we did when I worked at Passion. There was one that was a campaign for Burger King Kids Club, and the kids lived in a treehouse, and I remember this very tall piece of artwork on side pegs coming through with, there was going to be a tilt up the treehouse and then closing in, and there was another long sheet of paper with all of the camera diagrams and placements on it. And I heard people referring to this as a layout. So I guess roughly in my head I thought, well, the layouts must be the backgrounds before they've been coloured in. That must be what layout is. And then I got involved in doing computer work because I was hired by a company called Cambridge Animation Systems, who in the mid-90s had developed a system called Animo. And in its earlier incarnation, the goal had been to create automatic in-betweening using Bezier curve-based sort of vector system. And I guess it could have developed into something like Flash. People are much more familiar with that kind of flat animation style thing where you don't have the brains of the computer they're thinking in the X and Y axes, but they're not thinking depth, they're not thinking in the Z or the Z axis. And when they then developed an ink and paint system, they already had a tremendous matting system and camera system and compositing software. And as soon as they added digital ink and paint to that package, DreamWorks bought it, Warner Brothers bought it, and the Warner Brothers people were in the early stages of doing this Space Jam project, which had started life as an advert during the Super Bowl, where you had Michael Jordan and Bugs Bunny, and it was a Nike advert, and somebody thought this could be developed. So my name was being mentioned because I'd been traveling around for a couple of years doing demos of this Animo software and training people how to use it. And I'd been to the States and Canada and France, and showing people how to use this software. So they knew here was this guy that understood the software package that they had just bought, but they also knew that my history was working in Roger Rabbit, so they thought, well, this is also cartoons and real people. So I got headhunted to go over and work for a year on Space Jam. And during that time, Disney had developed a job description of artistic coordinator. So you had people like Dan Hansen and Randy Fulmer, who had been already working for Disney, and they were unafraid of the new incoming digital toolkits, but they were also very, very well versed in all the traditional techniques. But they had kind of run out of people inside the studio that could be moved into this production position. And I had friends over at Disney who said, well, there's a guy kind of doing this at Space Jam at the moment, you should hire him. So I got to do that on Disney's production of Tarzan. And another of the sort of things there was that this was the first time that they were looking to position flat cell animated characters in a three-dimensional jungle. So they had this extraordinary technique they called Deep Canvas, which went on to win a Technical Academy Award. So again, you had that all these registration and matting and compositing issues that came up all the time in these other hybrid productions. Here we had this sort of digital, new ground being broken. For me, the really amazing thing was that I was required. It was in some ways, there was a lot of frustration working for the software people working at Warner's and working at Disney on Space Jam and Tarzan, because by that stage, people knew me as a sort of tech guy or a management guy, so I wasn't, an artist, even though all this artistic training and experience and what have you. So there was a frustration there. But again, in the same way that when I moved down to London to work for Sands Films on their live action film, where all this amazing stuff happened under one roof, in their right mind would turn down the opportunity to go and work for Disney in Burbank. I mean, you'd have to be crazy. And I was required to be a kind of proxy for Kevin Lima and Chris Buck, the directors, and Dan St. Pierre and Dan Cooper, the art directors. If they couldn't be around, I had to have been with them in different sessions and approvals so that I knew what their take was on certain things, or their answers or responses, or I was kind of, feeding information across the divide, as it were. So I had to go to all the approval sessions, and the guy who was in charge of layout ultimately on Tarzan was Jean-Christophe Poulin. And I remember going in with the directors and the art directors to the first of the approval sessions for the layout on Tarzan, and I just looked at all this stuff and I thought, God, these are the guys who make the movie. All this other stuff that I just never grasped about how did a scene become that length? How did you develop from the storyboard where you have all of these story sketches pinned to the wall, and how does that become a story reel or an animatic or a Leica reel, as we would have called it in commercials? And here are the people who did that this incredible kind of air traffic control of techniques and processes and skills. And then further down the line, when I came back to the UK and people had begun, suddenly the art colleges and universities were interested in animation, but they had become interested in it, a lot of them, because it had become possible for them to buy 3D software packages like Maya or Softimage or whatever. But they were kind of, some of them, without naming names, were sort of reversing into all this. They didn't have the underlying knowledge or understanding about movie making. They weren't necessarily always teaching students also how to draw or how to plan or how to design. And in that process where I was trying to fill the gaps in my own knowledge by buying books about those aspects of movie making, animation, history and technique that I wasn't familiar with or didn't know enough about myself because I'd never studied it, I built up my own library of stuff, and every time I tried to go out and buy a book that explained about layout, I couldn't find one. I could find lots of wonderful examples of layout artwork in the Pierre Lambert book about Pinocchio in particular, just these gorgeous, beautiful graphite drawings of the panning shots. But it needed more than that, because the other thing that happened during the 90s was that the digital revolution meant that these rostrum cameras that all of the people who trained as hand-drawn animation artists of any description, you were preparing artwork that was going to be photographed on a rostrum camera, and you were completely tied down to what the physical reality was of that camera on the tower over the table, or if you were working with a multiplane camera with the different levels of it. But the digitizing of the process, and in the 90s, even if you were still drawing characters in pencil on paper, that wasn't being transferred onto cell any longer. That was being digitized and filled in the computer with digital ink and paint. So effectively, these enormous bits of kit that were the kind of pivot technically at the middle of the animation industry, they just disappeared in this kind of digital puff of smoke in the middle of the 1990s.
Yeah.
So when you started talking to students about camera moves, they would be using something inside a computer that was really just a little mathematical construct. It was a little wireframe sort of icon of a movie camera with, you know, the magazine on the top and the lens out the front.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to a group of students and taking them back in history to the point at which the first cameras were available, when painters like Vermeer were using the camera obscura. And this guy put his hand up and went, "Why do I need to know about the history of the camera?" I said, "Because you guys are the first generation of animators who may never touch one. You'll have a pull-down menu that will give you all these lens options, but if you don't understand what the impact is, if you don't know the optical properties of a physical lens, and you then start..." The danger a lot of the time with particular approaches to digital filmmaking is that people start making films on a shot-by-shot basis, and then when you try and stick it all together, you get these really bumpy collision points where you'll have these great moments of sort of disconnect, and you think, "Oh, okay." And again, that goes back to this whole idea of the planning and the patience that's involved in doing stuff by hand. And I think that's one of the most dangerous things about the digital toolkit. And I'm not a Luddite. I love, you know, it's just a toolkit. I'm fine about whatever anybody uses. But there's a sense that, you know, I want it now. I want this to happen now. You know, and if you don't have patience about the process, why are you animating? You know, but it doesn't matter what toolkit you use. If you're involved in producing animation, if you're not patient, you probably ought to be doing something else. So, yeah, I kind of crashed into most of the things that I wound up working on. Most of it, for me, has not been a case of finishing one project and then thinking, "Oh, well, maybe I'll work on this or maybe I'll work on that." I've hardly ever had a series of sort of choices in front of me about, well, I will go and do this. Is usually whatever the next rock is in the stream of fast-moving water that you can jump to and land and not get carried away by the current, or whatever the metaphor is. But yeah, it's a real patchwork of I hesitate to call it a career, but but the great thing doing the book was that once the publisher said okay to the idea of doing it, you know, because I knew somebody who was working at Chronicle Books, and I said, "How do you guys commission something if somebody says there is a gap on the animation history bookshelf?" They'd already done this really beautiful book by Craig Barron and Mark Cortavaz, the Invisible Art book, about the history of matte painting, and they did this one, which is just so beautiful.
Oh, that's nice.
And I had said to them, you know, as well as doing all the art of books for, this is probably I don't know, does this infringe copyright? I don't know, beautiful.
I don't know.
But obviously Pixar's art of books are published by Chronicle, so are some of the Disney ones now, and they were fine about the idea. They were quite excited about the idea of the book, but I knew that I couldn't I write the book. I mean, I didn't write the book. I compiled it. I went and I met with all these different artists and technicians, asked them what they felt needed to be in the book, and then I met with all the archive people and the studio people and talked to the private collectors, and put it together to create the kind of book that, had I been able to study animation back when I was a student in the 1980s, I would have loved to have had all that information in one place. And it's good so far that the response from students and colleges has been a sort of generous and welcoming thing, that, oh great, somebody's stuck all this information in one place between the covers of one book. But yeah, I'm probably, I don't know from here on in what I'm likely to be doing within the industry itself, but that's where I started off, and this is where I landed. So
awesome. I mean, there's so much great content in there. Like, I should have probably written down my question, because there were certain sections. Like when you started talking about the importance of understanding filmmaking in general and how that relates to animation. Like I can relate, because when I was at university, it was all about the digital tools, and I got frustrated as well that they weren't teaching me any traditional drawing stuff. And for some reason I was like, I felt that it was necessary, but they were teaching us something very different. And then what do you know? Of course, when going out and talking to animators who were in the industry, those the good ones at least were saying, traditional art skills are imperative, because it really just gives another depth to the animation process itself, and filmmaking as well. Of course, can't forget that.
Yeah, I think so. The other thing, this just occurred to me the other day when I was, for the first time, I was asked to do a presentation about the book at a book festival rather than an animation festival. And this was every year. I was really lucky. I grew up in Edinburgh, and because my dad worked in the newspapers, he would get review tickets to lots of things. And at the end of August, the beginning of September, there's this annual international arts festival in Edinburgh. So they have ballet, opera, fine art, all kinds of things. But they also had a book festival. But it occurred to me that if you go back to when the first movie makers were making any kind of film, whether it was an animated one, whether it was the Alice comedies or the Out of the Inkwell series, or whether it was the silent Max Sennett or Charlie Chaplin movies, the audiences going into the fairground tent or into the cinema or wherever they actually saw these movies in the particularly in the early 20th century, the amount of time that they were spending in their lives sitting watching images moving on a screen was tiny in comparison to the amount of time they spent actually at their place of work or in their home with their family or out in the, if they were farmers, out in the landscape. We're now in a position where around the world, in the developed nations where people have the disposable income, large numbers of kids are growing up, and they are actually spending more of their waking time, far more of their waking time, in a gaming environment or in a virtual world that is there in a movie or a game, or they're even when they're traveling to work, they're not looking out of the window of the train. They're sitting there with their gaming device or their mobile phone. So our relationship to reality, there's a danger that I wouldn't go so far as to say that it becomes kind of compromised, but what drawing does is it makes you pay attention. And it's not like paying attention in a classroom where the teacher says, sit up straight and pay attention and I'll tell you the 3 times table. If you're drawing something, I remember one of the things that really blew me away when I was trying to put my folio together to go to art college. I had a hyacinth, grown from a bulb, and I looked at it and I thought, I wonder if I actually have the patience to try and paint this thing, because it was so intricate, because it's not like a rose where you have one flower head at the top of a stem. There's all these tiny little ones. And it took me all day to paint it, and it grew while I was painting it.
Wow.
That really blew me away, because I was looking and thinking, but that wasn't there. And so this thing was sort of quietly, and it was twisting as it was growing. and I was spent so many hours drawing it that I was thinking about stuff that I would never otherwise have thought about. And I think a lot of the processes that we have become accustomed to through no fault of our own, other than our sort of getting carried away with the technological tide, our attention spans have really just fragmented. And I think that's the other thing that is wonderful about the drawing process, that it's not so much that it slows you down, but I think it has some of the qualities to it that, you know, meditation or prayer or contemplate, you know, there's all kinds of different practices that people use, whether it's in yoga or whether it's in religious practice or whatever, where you just, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to concentrate on that, the phone is off the hook, the door is shut, you know, that kind of stuff. And I think that really does have a role to play. The other thing that I think is crazy is that we just tend not to encourage people to draw anyway. It's seen as this, there is a sort of, in a lot of people will say, oh, I can't draw. And you say, well, have you ever tried? And it's something that people will do at kindergarten, then they stop. You know, you're given crayons and pencils and paints and stuff at kindergarten, and then there's a kind of shut up. It's like, stop doing that. You know, you're not going to be making images or drawing or looking at stuff. That will be a special, weird little thing that a small group of you will do later on. But why is it any more weird than sport or music or, you know, give me a break? I mean, I've been watching the Olympics. I think it's wonderful, but is doing a drawing any more strange than developing a particular skill at being able to ride a bicycle in a circle very fast? With gold medal for, you know, fine, I get, that's great, I admire it, but what does it actually produce? And I think that one of the great things when you go back and look at drawings that physically were done by, you know, Michelangelo or Kathy Colts, and you see the silver point or the chalk or the pen or the ink or charcoal or whatever it is, and you know the person who made that mark, the person they were drawing was relative to this piece of paper, was over there, you know, and here it is in a frame hundreds of years later or tens of years later. And when I was looking at all of the archive material at the Disney archive, and they opened up one of the plan chest drawers where some of the painted artwork was for the interior of Geppetto's workshop, I was in tears. I just, you know, because it was a real kind of Dead Sea Scrolls moment. You know, that was it. That was the piece of artwork that was on the camera table being photographed, and that's the one that's in the movie. And some group of people were responsible for deciding it would look this way, and then some artist just sat there and worked on it till it was done. So yeah, that I must have this now, and it must be immediate, and it must be fast, and it must be perfect. I don't really get that, and I think that there's a danger sometimes that not the use, but the misuse of the digital toolkits tends sometimes to encourage that sense that miracles happen in a very short period of time, and they don't. You know, you have to work at it. There isn't anybody who's looking at shortcuts. It's usually a danger sign. If you want to get in and get it on schedule and under budget, but otherwise, no. You know, if you plan it correctly, you shouldn't be having to panic and take shortcuts anyway. So
yeah, I guess looking from that perspective, it really is no different from a professional athlete. You know, in terms of putting in the hard yards, the discipline, knowing that you're gonna make mistakes, and completely agree with that.
Yeah, or a musician. And I'm not meaning to be dismissive of anybody who's an athlete or a sports person or whatever. That's fine. It's admirable. Yeah. But I find it peculiar that we're also accepting of these weird kind of ritualistic things like football. You know, a bunch of millionaires in shorts getting a little round thing into a big stringy thing. Fine, I get it, but it's that's great. But I don't see that my sitting and drawing a tree or a shed or something is more weird than that. You know, I don't see why I should be made to feel that I'm somehow a strange person because I want to sit and create an image of something when you guys are running around kicking a ball into a net. Good luck to you. Fine, it's great. But don't make me feel like there's something creepy about me because I want to go and do this. It's weird, you know.
I mean, that's probably why, I mean, like with indigenous cultures, and I think this is why I probably relate to a lot of things that you say, especially about the meaning, or you were talking about, you know, a lot of, I mean, I'm guilty as well, being on our phones all the time, you know, not paying enough attention to the world around us. And it was like the more, you know, I reconnected with indigenous cultures or even my own culture, you know, a lot of these stories, like even the whole thing around storytelling itself, you know, it was done around a campfire, you know, where all the kids came and they were attentive. And every aspect of their stories was about nature and being more aware of nature, you know, and that's what art, drawing, filmmaking, those sort of things bring to it as well. You know, like some of the stories, so say from Tuvalu as well, some of the stories have that naturalistic element where, you know, they talk about Aboriginal, saltwater crocodile, you got the totems there, right? Not only is it there to ignite the imagination of kids or people, it's also there to say we need to respect that animal. Right? It gives a deeper meaning so that when you look at it, it's not just another dangerous creature. Right? And then you also see that the interactions with these animals is, you know, in some of these areas, they're actually able to go to these crocodiles and, like, pet it and touch it and, you know, and I can't explain it sometimes. Right?
Yeah.
So, you know, like with all this colonization that happened throughout history, they looked at it as primitive societies, but it's like they're still around, you know, even though they may be minorities, they're still around, but they're able to tap into that meaning aspect. And this is why I say animation has a lot that serves indigenous stories, and indigenous stories has a lot of aspects that serve animation, because they share that whole, you know, the patience, teaching discipline, being aware of your surroundings, those sort of things.
Yeah, I think I remember when I immediately after I finished work on Roger Rabbit, a bunch of us went over to see the premiere of it in New York, and I hadn't crossed the Atlantic before. I hadn't had the chance. No, I did a 5-week film course in New York in 1984, but I had been to visit. I had friends and relatives in Canada, and I'd never been to Canada. And one of the guys I had met on the film course in New York in 1984 worked out in Vancouver, and I went to stay with them after we'd seen the Roger Rabbit premiere in New York. And I remember buying a book in a bookstore on Granville Island in Vancouver by an anthropologist called Hugh Brody, and the book was called Maps and Dreams, and he wrote it in alternating chapters. And interestingly, this has been in the news again this week, because a lot of the indigenous groups of people in British Columbia in particular never actually signed away their land. It was so
classic.
The Brody book, he was, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, asked to go and discuss with, I think it was the Beaver Indians of British Columbia, what their ancestral and seasonal use was of the land. But the underlying narrative was that they were going to send another pipeline through there one way or another, and they had in some way to kind of dress it up that they were taking an interest in the indigenous people and blah blah. And he has the one chapter will be about him trying to fulfill his professional obligation, and then the next chapter it alternates with him gradually, quietly beginning to make sense of what they are telling him about the way their lives are led. And for me it was fascinating, because I never understood how so much of the trading was set up through things like the Hudson's Bay Company, and the terrible tendency for the sort of European people going in trying to find, you know, skins or stuff, you know, fur that they could send away. They would tend to create a trading post where they would establish a financial system that was locked into money that was only valid at the trading post, or scrip as they would call it in the mining usage of it, where miners could only pay at the company store. But they would also introduce hard liquor. So they would get people addicted to drink. They would be unable to stop. They would start making really bad decisions. I'm laughing because it's so grotesque. But I remember reading the book and just thinking, oh God, this is terrible. But the key things there was that the discussion with these people, they were saying, well, you guys come and you look at all this, and we don't use the landscape the way you use the landscape. You look at it as a way to fill the space with thousands of people. We look at the same numbers of square miles, and we look at how we will, as a smaller group of people, use that and be respectful of it in terms of the flora and the fauna and the resources over a period of 5 or 6 years. So we may not actually, you're saying, well, when we come back here in spring, we won't be here until, spring 7 years down the line.
Yep.
And I think that we've got this point now where we've had the photographs from space. We know that we're, the kind of bowling ball floating in the middle of nowhere. But the speed of development and industrial progress was so accelerated and so unprecedented. I don't know that there was anything in human experience up until the Industrial Revolution that let us know actually how to cope with that rate of change. And I think that what you find in the storytelling traditions, whether this is something that is in an urban context where people maybe for generations haven't had a contact with one particular indigenous culture, or people who just by nature of their family structure are actually born of 5 or 6 or 7 different indigenous traditions. The storytelling, the best thing I can think of that connects with it in my own experience, my grandmother, my father's mother, when she was a girl, every Saturday morning went to visit her grandmother and just listened to her grandmother tell stories about the family. When my father was in the Air Force in World War II, he was in North Africa in Libya, and each week he would write to his mother and his mother would write to him, and she would sometimes just get carried away and start writing things that she remembered of the family history. And he couldn't keep the letters, but he reignited the correspondence with her when my parents got married in the 50s. And I have folders of all these letters, and I have been through the archives, and she, in her head, had nearly 200 years of births, marriages, and deaths on her side and on her husband's side, because she soaked up this information. And that's the other thing that we are losing a little bit, that attention span, that shortness of attention, the way that we hold on to information, the tradition, the oral tradition of storytelling, and actually the interesting thing was that when Ben Okri, the Nigerian writer, was in Edinburgh at the book festival last week, it was to talk to the people from the Edinburgh Storytelling Centre about dramatising a short story that he's written recently. And the way that people use drama, the way you sit in a theatre, or as you said, around the campfire, and you imagine things being real, or you imagine ancestors still being alive, or whatever. I think there's a degree to which when we're sharing experiences in storytelling, in movie making, or in literature, however much our circumstances might kind of pull us away from those more sort of intimate or local structures, we're hardwired for it. So we home in on those things where we identify all those common strands, the things that no matter whether you grew up in a sort of snowy landscape, or whether you grew up in the tropics, or you grew up in London or whatever, those human truths of your experience, of your interaction with other people and with your world, they kind of those are the things that we do all connect with. It's a difficult thing too, because I think that it can work the other way. You can find that people are trying to manufacture a narrative to identify a particular market, or to invent. I think that's what worries me about a lot of what's happening here in Scotland at the moment, that the way that Scottish history is being presented is sometimes really quite alarmingly selective. And I think there are things that, yes, people can emphasise the points in Scottish history when groups of Scottish people have maybe been on the receiving end of bad treatment, culturally or politically. But, you have to own up to the fact also that a lot of families and companies in Scotland made a lot of money out of the slave trade. And you need to be honest with yourselves about what the different facets of your history are. And I think that the way that things get divided up so often in the Western storytelling tradition in movie making. What is interesting about the Miyazaki movies, you go through a movie like Princess Mononoke, who are the villains, who are the good guys, who are the... It's such it's so impossible to tell. And I think in some ways that's maybe more realistic, because the battle as we see it presented in so many of the kind of superhero movies and a lot of the very kind of violent imagery that you see on children's television now, and you've got these the superhero with the great power who just conquers everything. It's always evil or wickedness as an externalized force that has to be extinguished. And I think the books are a bit more right about the idea that this is actually a more rounded thing. We all have all of that potential inside us, and we have to recognize that, and our responsibility is to keep the balance and not go, in the Star Wars language, it's, don't go over to the dark side or whatever it is. But, the really interesting thing is how many more voices with, the Western world becoming aware of storytellers like Miyazaki and the other people that work at the Studio Ghibli and all the other people. It's great that the channels of distribution and communication now are as varied as they are. But I think people still need to be discerning about how they respond to these things, because it's tremendously easy to get people fired up with storytelling in a way that, when you see it used in the context of propaganda, just have to be you have to be aware of the fact that it's the same process, and you have a responsibility whether you like it or not.
Yes.
I think says the guy who works on a cornflakes commercial.
No, I agree completely with you though. Especially with the propaganda stuff. I mean, storytelling is such a basis of our societies. You take all the technology away, what do you have left to be able to pass on knowledge or information? Right? You got the stories. But
I also I'm not sure that I really believe that any of us are capable of being impartial when we tell stories. I don't think we're even capable of being impartial or neutral when we're just having a conversation between two people, because you edit as you talk. Your decision to talk about this and not that is an editorial and a manipulative decision. It's the nature of communication that anytime you're talking about one thing, there's a bunch of other stuff you're not talking about, or that you're maybe trying to, it's the idea that you can home in on anything that you could establish as being truth. I think that's a bit wobbly. That's a bit dangerous. I think you do have a responsibility, but I think it's important not to assume that you just have to be on your guard all the time, because it's tempting. As you tell a story, you're always drawn to finding a way of making yourself look good in how you're. If you know what I mean.
Yep. No, gotcha. Oh man, Fraser, it was awesome talking to you, and I think I'm gonna just cut the recording bit at least here, because well, I'm sure guys would be wow.
It's very good of you to invite me to come along and chat over all these thousands of miles. I just think it's dizzy.
But if you're okay with that, I'd love to chat again. Because
sure,
there's so much more that we can cover. But
sit around the digital campfire, as they say, or whatever.
Exactly. Who knows how we'll be doing it in the future as well? Might have a hologram, just right there in front of each other.
Even this is kind of this is pretty close to jetpack technology. I think this is. Who would have thought, that this would be. Because I've such clear recollections of how difficult it was to render the simplest of images on the computers that we were working on in the 1990s. Yeah. So the amount of kind of real-time telecommunication stuff that is now feasible, and just how expensive teleconferencing was during the 1990s also. And here, within a couple of decades, you're in Australia, I'm in Scotland, and in real time, we're having this conversation. I just think that really is the human brain around it.
Yeah. And I know, and some of the things that we complain about is it's too slow. You're talking about that everything now.
Somebody actually, a guy I know who runs an animation company in Glasgow called Once We're Farmers, a guy called Will, put a review of Setting the Scene on Amazon, which was pretty much saying that when you read Setting the Scene, you realize just what the definition of patience used to be in terms of how to get an image onto a piece of film. So it changes from it used to be from one generation to the next. The trouble now is that you go and buy something like I got an iPad recently, and you're at the point now where almost by the time you've reached the door of the shop, what you have bought is on its way to becoming obsolete. Because the speed at which it all develops is so accelerated. But yeah.
Oh man! And I was gonna even start talking about. Have you seen the animated short Das Rad?
No, well, yeah, I know the girl, one of the people who did it.
Really?
Heidi Wittlinger was working at Studio Ludovic when I was there in 2001. Working for Jimmy Murakami, and she came in one day and said, "Oh, I won't be in to work next week." And she said, "I'm going to Los Angeles." I said, "Are you going for a holiday?" And she said, "No, I've been nominated for an Academy Award." She and the other two students who made Das Rat, I remember her showing us the little videotape of it, and I just went, "Oh, wow, this is fantastic!" And actually, I just connected on LinkedIn with Heidi a couple of weeks back. But there's another tremendously talented animator, a guy called Mark Cohn, who was also from the Stuttgart Ludwigsburg Film Academy. But yeah, Das Rat is what a great film, isn't that? That's funny that you should home in on that, because I remember watching it just thinking, wow, they did this when they were students.
And when you were talking about everything, that was a movie that came to my head, about the acceleration and what's going to happen eventually.
And you see the landscape changing and all the kind of stuff going up and crumbling and empires arriving, and it's wild.
I think that's a film every animator has to see.
I agree.
But thank you again, Fraser, and well, let's talk again, because this was wonderful.
Thanks for inviting me, George, and best of luck with all the work, and I hope you get a good night's sleep.
Oh yeah, thanks. All right, thanks, Fraser.
Okay,
bye.
Take care.